Man here. I just watched the new Titanic movie, Mysteries from the Grave, True Stories from Titanic Survivors. And I'm here with Raf Avila, social media Titanic influencer. We have Titanic influencers nowadays. So first question, obviously, how does anyone, specifically you, become a Titanic influencer?
Yeah, that's a great question because I wouldn't have even known if it hadn't happened to me. But so I'll explain from the beginning. So obviously, for me, I've always been the Titanic. I've always been obsessed with the Titanic. It's always been my interest ever since I was a little kid. Um, I remember watching a documentary when I was little. I was really into it. And then a few months later, the movie in 1997 came out. So that sort of solidified my
Mm.
interest in the Titanic. So then for the next couple of years, in elementary school, all I would do for fun is I would go to the public library, take out every single book that I could find on the Titanic. So it's always really been part of my life. And I've always been used to talking about Titanic and having everyone around me ignore me because it's just me spewing Titanic facts and whatnot. Um, so now fast forward to April of 2020.
Okay.
This is now we're approaching the 108th anniversary of the sinking. And for many of us within the Titanic community, every April 14th and 15th, that's Titanic Day. That's the day the Titanic hit the iceberg and sank. So for many, many years, I'd been
Joyous
doing,
day.
yeah, for many years, I've been doing like I had commemorated, right? So I would watch the movie or do something else. And that day, I was getting ready to listen to a podcast on YouTube. There's a really good channel called Titanic Honor and Glory. They went viral a couple of years ago
Mm.
because they had a real-time animation of the Titanic sinking, which was really, really cool. And every year they had been doing a podcast. So I was getting ready with my scotch. And then
Ah.
I'd been experimenting with TikTok a little bit,
Mhm.
as I think everyone was like at the beginning of the pandemic. And I thought, I was like, hey, maybe I'll share an interesting Titanic story. I have a trillion of them here in my head. I'll make a TikTok about that. So I started fumbling around with my phone. I wasn't very well experienced with TikTok. So I filmed a couple of shots. I decided to feature the story of the drunk baker, Charles Jugan, which is a real story. And in the James Cameron movie, you see an actor play that drunk baker. There was a lot of very historically accurate moments in the movie. So I decided to, film a couple of shots there for the TikTok. I did a voiceover just explaining the story. I thought it'd be easier than me typing stuff out. And then I also included some captions. And then boom, yeah, I sent the TikTok. And probably within a few minutes, I started noticing that the view count started going up. It went like
Oh.
100 views, then 300 views, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 at a rate that I'd never seen before. Just boom, took off. And I was like, oh, what is happening right now? So it was pretty crazy. So I left my phone alone. I continued with my Titanic activities. I watched the podcast. And then the next day, I woke up and that TikTok had nearly 2 million views and I had gained nearly 10,000 followers overnight. So I was like, whoa, this is crazy. So basically, I took that opportunity to share some more Titanic, facts and survivor stories. So I just kept on posting more TikToks in a similar style, featuring John Jacob Astor, featuring the unsinkable Molly Brown,
Right.
Margaret Brown, all these different survivor stories. And every single one of those videos just started going quite viral. So I would get 1 million views, 2 million views. And then very quickly, my follower count sort of started exploding. So that's when I realized I'm like, hey, maybe there is an audience for
Oh
people
yeah,
that are into the Titanic. Maybe I'm not alone
you're not.
with my Titanic obsession. So that's how everything really began. And now we have obviously the TikTok page. I have my Instagram page where I also post the TikToks too, and then I have the YouTube channel. So that's how I became sort of a Titanic influencer.
And
It's weird to say.
what's the name of your TikTok channel and Instagram channel for
Yeah,
anyone
so the TikTok channel is just Raf_Avila, so my name.
watching?
But if you search on any of the social medias, you search Titanic Guy, Raf, you'll find me. So On Instagram, it's Titanic.guy. My YouTube page is just my name. So just search Titanic Guy. There's also a website, TitanicGuy.com. Anything, it's all branded Titanic Guy to keep things
So
simple.
Titanic Guy, question on conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist, but a lot of the things that I've been thinking for 20 years have turned out to be true, like
Yeah.
sunscreen. Anyway, so we'll stick to Titanic. We'll go away from sunscreen and wine and butter.
Yeah.
All right. Number one, the captain sent the wrong color flares. He sent the white flare, signaling no problem. Number two, ignored warnings from the boat, the Californian. Number three, the evacuation drill was skipped so people could be comfortable and go to church instead. Don't get me started on the formalities and traditions overtaking efficient steps that are needed to save people's lives every day. And
Yeah.
then number four, only 27 people filled a lifeboat, which could have accommodated like 50 or 60. So it looks like whoever the staff was, which, I'm sure they were a little befuddled, but people weren't like forcing people to evacuate or people didn't want to. So those are
Yeah.
four reasons right now that, the safety wasn't, maybe things could have been avoided. What do you think? And
I
there was a
have
lot of rich
many,
people on that boat.
yeah, I have many, many thoughts. Because obviously, whenever in the Titanic community, you always have these theories that pop up because it's one of these events where everybody, I mean, we're still talking about it 110 years later. It's obviously generated a lot of interest. And when something generates a lot of interest, people like to scrutinize and take a look at everything. So there's always been this faction within the Titanic community that really tries to rationalize a lot of what happened and creates these theories. I'm not a big fan of using the term conspiracy theory.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because it's an easy way to discount somebody just asking some legitimate questions.
Yes.
But with a lot of the questions that you're asking, we really have to look at what the actual facts were. So the very first question that you asked me about were the flares. And I know that it was talked about in the documentary. And for many, many years, it was indeed believed that Titanic shot off white flares because there were a lot of eyewitness accounts that there were white flares. And if you look at the regulations back then, it's believed that the white flares represented something else. And if you wanted to signal that you were in distress, you would do different colored flares. But a few years ago, I believe, there were some discoveries made on the ocean floor. And for many, many years, decades, it was common knowledge the Titanic shot off the white flares. However, on the ocean floor, they actually discovered the canisters, the rocket canisters that were used in order to shoot off the rockets. And the interesting thing about that is that in the canisters, there was a little hole punched into the copper where you could see the colors. So anybody shooting off the rockets could see what they're about to shoot. And what we realized is that there were white canisters and there were also red ones and green ones and other different color ones. So our knowledge that we had, it wasn't actually just white flare shot off. It was multiple colors that were shot off. Back then, there wasn't an actual standard as to what color should be signaled in order to signal that you're in distress. So what the crew did on the Titanic, Fourth Officer Boxhall, who was the one shooting off the flares, he just shot off every single flare. So it's something that has been talked about a lot. But if you look at the situation, they were just shooting off any sort of rockets, right? Now, when it comes to the Californian, there is testimony that the Californian did see rockets being shot off in the distance. And of course, that would have been the Titanic. So there's been a lot of scrutiny for the crew on the Californian being like, well, why didn't you try to contact the Titanic?
Yeah.
They did try to contact the Titanic, but unfortunately, they didn't really think to wake up their radio operator to actually contact them. So what they did try to do is to contact them via Morse lamp. Titanic never saw that, and vice versa. California never saw a response from the Titanic, so they assumed that everything was okay. When they saw the lights that they had seen in the distance, when they saw that disappear, they figured that Titanic had just gone the other way and we're fine. They never would have imagined that Titanic would have sank. The other point regarding
the documentary said that the California tried to warn them and they were like, no thanks. And like the captain cursed them out. And then the flares were set and they were like, well, we were trying to warn you. So too bad.
So actually, I remember because I just watched a documentary yesterday. I was the one that pointed out that particular moment.
Right.
But if you look at that, so what had happened was throughout the entire day, the wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, they'd been receiving multiple warnings from different ships in the area, other ships that had just gone through the similar area, and they had been issuing the same warning. There's ice, right? So they receive one warning, there's ice in this area. Okay, thank you. They receive another warning, there's ice in this area. Okay, thank you. Another warning, ice in this area. And they kept on relaying those messages to the
Hmm.
captain. If it's one of those messages that are coded to the captain, that has to go to the captain. The captain never once ignored any warnings, even though that tends to be sort of a common story that's told. He didn't ignore any ice warnings. He took them, and then he make note of them. He made note of them.
But it looks like he
Um,
took them and he went the wrong way anyway.
so what happened was, as the day progressed, Harold Phillips and Jack, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, they were very, very busy taking in people's messages, handling all these different things. And then all of a sudden they hear a booming, like a message come in from the Californian saying the same message that they had already heard 5-6 times in the day, be like, there's ice. So in a human moment, Jack Phillips was like, listen, shut up. I know I'm working Cape Race. Stop. This coincidentally happened to be at around the same time when the radio operator on the Californian was about to go to bed anyway, right? So that was kind of like a final, like, okay, well, yeah, this is the end of my night. This dude just told me to shut up. So
Right.
okay, I'm just going to call it a night. Back then, the regulations didn't state that ships required 24-hour coverage. So his shift was ended. He was just listening in and he decided to issue a warning to the Titanic. He got that response. He's like, okay, calling it a night, going to bed. And unfortunately, nobody woke him up to try to communicate later with the Titanic.
Okay. An evacuation drill, that's a little suspect. Oh, we'll let them go to church. I don't know. Church happens all the time. Shouldn't they have done an evacuation drill? That's a little weird too.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that was sort of coincidental in the sense that there was going to be a church service anyway. I wouldn't say that they stopped the evacuation drill to let them go to church. I would say that it was more so dealing with the weather conditions and everything that was happening that day that where they canceled the drill. I think whenever you see sort of these documentaries, you like to make connections. It's like, oh, they decided to let these people go to church.
Right.
The truth is that there was a little bit of a drill before Titanic set sail. So the crew members, it's not like they were entirely confused. I did see in the documentary, they really play up the aspect that, yeah, there was confusion. There was confusion, but there were drills done with those new type davits. There were, however, no drills done with the passengers because when the original day that was planned, as I mentioned, the weather wasn't really suitable. And one of the other things that I mentioned in the documentary is that you got to remember how lifeboats were back then. They're not like how you see in the cruise ships today, where you have the electronic, wrenches and everything. It's quite the ordeal. It requires a lot of manpower, and it's very much manual. So you want to be very careful whenever you're having lifeboat drills with passengers, because there is an inherent risk that something is going to go wrong, and you don't want something going wrong in the middle of the ocean.
Right. And then the other point, 27 people filling a lifeboat. This just goes, it kind of is like that joke where the guy says, help me, God, help me. He sends a lifeboat. He sends a helicopter. You go, why did you help me? He's like, I sent all these things. You didn't want them.
You don't want to do it. You got to do it.
It's like me all the time. I try to warn people and then they're like, oh, I got lost. It's like, hey, I try.
Yeah, no. So the other thing to remember is we got to transport ourselves back to what was happening. So you're absolutely right. There were some lifeboats that were filled to even less than half of the capacity. There was a lot of controversy with lifeboat number 1, for example. That's the lifeboat that infamously had only 12 people, only 12 people on that lifeboat. And it was a couple of first class passengers, the Duff Gordons. They became very prominent. And then later there was a controversy where people accused them of paying off to get a private boat. That's bogus. That's not actually the case. But the reason why a lot of those early lifeboats left with such few capacity is people didn't really think the Titanic was sinking. people, it's hard to believe now because we can look back and we know what happened at the events. We know the Titanic sinks at 2:20, right? So you start almost counting down the clock from 11:40, be like, okay, we have 2 hours and 40 minutes. Let's get everybody out. But if we transport ourselves back to when Titanic hit the iceberg, people didn't really know the extent of the damage, at 11:40. So the officers, they had to go in there, they had to inspect, they had to see whether the ship was damaged, whether it was mortal damage. And even in doing that, the captain ordered all of his crew to start getting the lifeboats ready just in case. He took a precautionary measure just to be ready in case it did have to take that unprecedented step of evacuating passengers in the middle of the night. So it took a while for the crew to get confirmation that Titanic was sinking. It was really around almost an hour before they were 100% sure. And one of the things that I mentioned in the documentary is the captain had to be 100, a trillion, a billion% sure that this was the right measure, because you are putting people in the middle of the ocean into rickety boats that are being brought down by ropes, right? So it's not, it's by no means a small decision. It's a very, very big decision that he had to make. So the other factor to that is that the crew and the captain, the officers, they knew that there weren't enough lifeboats for everybody aboard. So they had to ensure that there was order, that there was no panic, and there was also no public service announcement system. So initially people were told, oh, everything is fine. Then as things got a little bit, worse and they realized, okay, we need to evacuate, they told them, okay, put your lifebelts on, please go up to the boat deck. We're going to be doing a drill. Some people thought that they had dropped a propeller. Some people, they knew that something was a little bit off because they could hear that the engines had stopped. That was very jarring for a lot of people. For they have the engines constantly going, and then all of a sudden in the middle of the night, it stopped. So people thought that it was going to be a boat drill. Some individuals thought the Titanic was taking on water, but they knew that Titanic could stay afloat because of the compartments. So some individuals believed that they needed to put some people into the lifeboats to take some weight off of the Titanic in order for Titanic to level off, right? So most individuals early on in the night, at around 12:40, 12:45, when the first lifeboat went off, they figured that Titanic was safe. There may have been some trouble, but by no means would anybody have been able to predict that Titanic would actually have was going to sink. So nobody wanted to volunteer to go into the boats and take one for their team and just bob there for a few hours before being let back on. It was a very cold night, so it was very hard to convince people to go into the lifeboats, right? A lot of people didn't want to go. You compare wooden lifeboat, middle of the ocean, compared to the,
these
warm,
are like fancy schmancy people. The owner of they're like, I want to go in a Benz lifeboat. This is like a Honda Civic lifeboat. No offense to Honda Civic.
Why would they choose to go into the wooden lifeboats when they can just stay on the nice, warm, seemingly safe ship? So it was very hard to convince people to get into those early lifeboats. And at the same time, First Officer Murdoch and Second Officer Lightoller, they knew that they had a very limited amount of time. So they really needed to clear those forward lifeboats first because the ship was going down first, right? So it's better their thought was like, okay, let's get as many people into this boat and launch as quickly as possible and keep on going. So that's why you see a lot of those lifeboats, they weren't filled to capacity. People were not willing to get into them. They needed to get as many people out of there as possible.
Now you said, who would know the ship is sinking? So two things, the documentary said Esther Hart would lie awake at night, prepared to leave anytime. So there was one passenger who had premonition, supposedly, not be, that the ship would maybe sink, and she would stay dressed at night, ready to leave. And then Edith Russell asked for her bags to be taken off. She almost didn't go. And then she changed her mind and she went. So there's two people that had bad feelings. Now, maybe they're coincidence, maybe they're nervous Nellies, or maybe do you believe in premonitions that maybe, they had some foresight, they had some little clues.
Yeah. With all those like anecdotal stories, I always it's always interesting to read because somebody in the Titanic community, we've read a lot of these stories throughout the years where people say, I had a bad feeling. Or there are stories of people having had dreams and then they just feel uncomfortable. And I think whenever you have such a big disaster or any big piece of technology, you will have some individuals that have a bad feeling about something.
Right.
Luckily, most of the time, it doesn't materialize into anything. So we don't hear about those bad feelings. But when it does turn into a disaster, the 1 in a million chance, then I think that's when those stories come out. So I don't really know. Maybe it's intuition, maybe it was foresight, maybe it was just, who knows what it was.
Next, trust issues. I got lots of trust issues. Just this week, I was told on a film set, your cold time's 10. Now it's 12. Now it's 3. Now it's 5. We didn't start filming till
Yeah.
7:30. Oh, we're going to record today. Oh, the audio doesn't work. I went into my real estate job. Oh, we don't need you. I went all the way there, set up. So here's another thing. The Titanic was declared in press releases, the vessel declared to be unsinkable. It's
Yeah.
unsinkable. There's all these press releases. Why are all these people saying things are unsinkable before the thing happened? How do we know that? That's kind of silly.
It sounds silly to us today because I think we're not a trusting society nowadays. We take everything with a grain of salt, and I agree. And I think that's the right approach. I don't really
Right.
trust, in today, if you were to say something,
How'd you know I was going to show up at 12?
ship cannot sink, this car cannot crash, people will be like, what are you saying? Like don't say
Yeah.
that. But again, I think we really got to go and try to imagine what things were like back then. So in 1912, humanity, the world, and especially America and the West, we're going through the Industrial Revolution. So the prevailing mentality at the time is that, listen, we can really achieve anything if we put our minds to it with technology, with science. We are pretty much invincible. So all of humankind was sort of a little bit arrogant in that sense. They really placed a lot of trust in their technology. They felt invincible. So Titanic wasn't the first ship to be called unsinkable. Just to note, we oftentimes we think that, oh yeah, Titanic was unsinkable, but many other ships at the time, as technology was evolving, this was common for people to say, listen, here's new technology. We have watertight doors. These ships are designed to not sink, because of course no ship is designed to sink. You know what I mean? No ship is designed to sink. So that they sort of leaned into those safety qualities and everything. So a lot of these ships were designed to be sort of like their own lifeboats, right? If they get breached here, there's mechanisms in place to contain the water. So all the press at the time, they really wanted to focus on the safety. Now, it is important to note, and I know that the documentary talked about this, and I'm glad that it was brought up, that the White Star Line never officially declared or guaranteed the Titanic was unsinkable. What happened was that there was an article in a shipbuilders magazine outlining a lot of Titanic's new safety features. And in this magazine, they described the 16 watertight compartments, the automatic watertight doors that could come down. So there were a lot of really cool safety features. And they pretty much said that the ship was designed to be unsinkable. The press sort of took that, and then the prevailing thought was basically, oh yeah, Titanic is unsinkable. And of course, everybody else around that, they just took that and were like, okay, Titanic is unsinkable. Titanic is unsinkable. So even though it was never officially advertised as unsinkable, it is true that the majority of passengers and people, and even a lot of the crew, they were under the impression that Titanic was unsinkable.
And the final thing, well, I have to just say that there were 40,000 eggs on the boat. What do we call it? A boat?
The ship, yeah, the ship.
Sorry, I don't know nautical terms. I'm on land. I like my feet planted on land.
Yeah.
So I don't know this stuff. 75,000 pounds of meat, 36,000 apples, 336 gallons of drinking water. And the final point I will make before we close is that I always say that women and men should be dressed functionally. We should be dressed in things that we can make things happen. You know, if I'm dressed in heels, I'm not going to get anything done. I can't walk across the room. If I'm
Yeah.
dressed in this tight skirt, which the women were, apparently there were women that couldn't even jump onto the lifeboats. One account said, my great grandmother had to leap into a lifeboat 70 feet over the water, but their skirts were so tight they prohibited movement. Hey, if they were dressed like me right now, no problem, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
the only lesson of the Titanic, there's only one lesson, is to dress functionally.
The
Forget all
athleisure trend should have happened 110 years ago. That's
the tight jeans. Like, what are you crazy? You're
yeah, exactly.
die. It's life or death if you wear tight jeans. So yeah, so any final thoughts before we close?
Yeah, I mean, with the Titanic, it's just so interesting because, as I mentioned, we're still talking about it 110 years later, right?
Mhm.
It's one of these events where it really was almost like a perfect storm of of factors that went into the sinking of the Titanic. You know, the prevailing mentality at the time, the way that people thought of technology, what Titanic represented, you know, the luxury, the first class passengers, you know, famous people, wealthy people, powerful people, the third class passengers who represented people looking for new opportunities, that optimism that they were going to go start a new life. All this packaged into, you know, one of the greatest engineering marvels at the time and the biggest ship in the world, on the maiden voyage, to be taken down by something so simple as, you know, an inanimate object, an
Ice.
iceberg in the middle of the ocean, and then for the ship to sink in such a way, so slow, 2 hours and 40 minutes, for all of this drama to play out. And the one thing that I will say is, sometimes people like to scrutinize. It's like, oh wait, Titanic was made out of crappy metal. You know, the iron that was used was not good. Titanic was a bad ship. No, in fact, it was a complete opposite. Titanic was built so well that if you look at a lot of the other ships at the time, they wouldn't have lasted as long as Titanic. We see other shipwrecks where, for example, you know, the Lusitania, obviously that was a very different type of shipwreck, but that ship went down very quickly. Titanic, it's crazy to see a shipwreck, you know, almost 3 hours she was able to stay afloat, fighting to stay afloat so that as many people could get off the ship as possible. So I think it's one of these events that it really captures us. No matter what, there's people going to be looking at, were there any other theories that went into this? Was it really the fire that caused it? Was it
Mhm.
this? But I think if we want the really simple answer, is sometimes, you know, it's we try to rationalize things by looking at these theories, but sometimes the answer is very simple. It's just, it was a very unfortunate event. There was the iceberg, Titanic at the iceberg, and then these 2,200 individuals had to figure out what to do in those 2 hours and 40 minutes. And really, it was a date with destiny that night, as the documentary says. And I think it's one of those dates that we'll be revisiting for hundreds of years to come.
I'm never gonna look at the ice trays in my freezer the same way. I'm just gonna like, I'm looking at my freezer right now. I'm like, I shouldn't get too close because maybe I won't make it to this movie premiere tonight because I don't know. Those ice. Well,
Or you'll play with the ice tray and be like, oh, this is how Titanic sank. Boom, boom, boom.
I'm
You
gonna get an
confirm that.
assistant to deal with my ice trays because you never know. Really bad joke. That's what I do because I'm a dad. I do identify as a dad. So this has been El Man with Raf Avila, and thank you so much. And more back to more. It came from the radio. Mm.